Rebecca Lippman earned a master's in comparative literature at Cambridge and is now writing her doctoral dissertation in comparative lit at UCLA, fully funded. How did she do it? And what has her work at UCLA's Scholarship Center taught her about funding? Let's find out. Welcome to the 286th episode of Admissions Straight Talk, Accepted's podcast dedicated to graduate admissions and helping you approach the application process thoughtfully and successfully. I'm Linda Abraham, the founder of Accepted and the host of this podcast. My mission and passion is to help you show that you both fit in at your target schools and are a standout in the applicant pool. The result, you get a message one day that causes you to jump up and down shouting, "Yes, I'm accepted," and not only accepted, but accepted to the best program for you. In addition, this podcast is also going to be about how to pay for it, or more accurately, how to get the money to help you pay for it. This podcast is brought to you by Accepted's Graduate Admissions Consulting. If you want to access experience and expertise, save time, and optimize your application before your looming deadlines, visit www.accepted.com/grad/services. Submit your best. Our guest today is Rebecca Lippman, who recently joined Accepted's team of admissions consultants. However, she is here today mostly in her capacity as scholarship expert, having personally secured funding for her master's and doctoral studies, as well as having worked for 3.5 years in UCLA's Scholarship Resource Center. Let's learn her secrets. Rebecca, welcome to Admissions Straight Talk.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in comparative lit?
Sure. I became interested in comparative literature because when I went to college, my main goal of going to college was to study abroad and become fluent in another language. That was something that I was interested in from a very young age. I grew up in Oakland and heard a lot of Spanish at school. And even in high school, I wanted to study abroad. So that's what I went to UCLA and I said to my professors, how do I study abroad and get a double major at the same time? And comparative literature was one of the avenues to do that.
Okay, that's an interesting reason. Yeah, that's different.
That's how I was thinking when I was 18. I really wanted to be immersed in a university classroom in another language. But I stuck with it, and that eventually being able to learn Portuguese and Spanish and study abroad in those languages allowed me to have access to research that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. And so by the time I graduated,
research in what?
In literature and film. So I started to do research about novels from other countries and also film, not just the films themselves, but the business of film and how film worked in different countries.
Well, UCLA is a fantastic place to study that.
It was. And I think, at the time I thought it's a good place for me to study abroad, but it was also a good place for me to be exposed
study film,
really good resources. Absolutely. Yes.
Right. Now, you earned your master's in the University of Cambridge and your master's in Latin American Studies. Why did you pursue your master's in Latin American Studies at Cambridge? And how did you get funded for a humanities master's degree?
Well, the University of Cambridge has a Latin American Studies Center that primarily houses experts in Latin American film. So when I was thinking at the end of my senior year, I was thinking about what I wanted to do. I really liked film, and I thought it would be neat to keep studying film, but I really wanted a regional focus. And most schools in the U.S. have language and literature departments and film departments. And frequently you're sort of standing between two departments to carry that kind of expertise. But Cambridge had a Center for Latin American Studies that pretty much dealt with film. So I could go there and work with someone who was an expert in Argentine film, Mexican film, Colombian film. There were experts in a variety of regions of Latin America. So that was primarily why I applied there. And then with the funding, that was your second part of your question.
That was the second part.
I also applied to Cambridge knowing that they had the Gates Cambridge Scholarship available, and so I thought it would be neat to get that. And I ended up being a finalist for Gates Cambridge, but didn't get it, and was offered a partial scholarship that covered most of my tuition at the time.
Okay.
So then I thought, I'm going to go.
Fully funded, but you were mostly funded.
I was mostly funded.
Okay. All right.
And I did not have to work for that funding.
Oh, okay. So you were a full-time student at Cambridge? Wonderful. Right. And how did you get, and now you are fully funded for your PhD studies at UCLA, right?
Yes.
Okay. And when you talk about being fully funded, that would be tuition and living expense. I mean, that's basically a full-time salary, an almost full-time salary.
Yes, I wouldn't compare it to a full-time salary in any other sector. But,
okay.
But it is, so when I got into UCLA for the PhD program in comparative literature, I received a package that's called full funding, but that includes guaranteed TA-ships. So part of full funding is having 1 or 2 years where you don't have to teach and you take your coursework and can do that without teaching on top of it. And the rest of most full funding packages include a TA-ship, which means that you TA for your department, and as a result of that, you get your tuition and fees waived and a living stipend. So that was the package. I received a package that was a mixture of both of those things at UCLA. And then I pursued other extramural fellowships as well.
Okay. Now, while pursuing your PhD, you've always been helping UCLA students get awards, grants, and scholarships. And before we turn to some of the specific scholarships, which I do want to ask about, what are your three top tips for getting awards and grants? I mean, you've got it at Cambridge, you've got it at UCLA, and all in the humanities where it's particularly difficult to get grants and scholarships.
I would say being creative is incredibly important to identifying scholarships in the first place. So
how does that creativity manifest itself?
It manifests itself by when I see successful students and going through the process of identifying scholarships, they're not just looking at the obvious places where the scholarships might come from. So for example, if a student is, or let's go with me, if I'm in the comparative literature department at UCLA, I'm not just going to rely on the comparative literature department's resources to fund me. I'm going to keep looking creatively for other areas, centers, institutes, and private donors who care about what I'm doing. And that's where you get creative, is broadening your search and really thinking, okay, who out there cares about what I care about? Who cares about me and the communities that I belong to? What communities do I care about? And when you start thinking broadly and creatively, then you have access to more resources. I think a lot of students don't realize how much is out there in the first place.
So for example, let's take you, okay? You are an Anglo female interested in Latin American film, right? So
yes.
Would you look for scholarships for people interested in film in general, in Latin American film specifically, scholarships for women in liberal arts? I mean, how would
Yes. I would start with, usually I have students pick 25 different search terms. So for me, I'm a woman in the humanities. I'm half Jewish, so I can also look at the Jewish community for scholarships. And there are also opportunities based on my language skills. So some of the grants that I got were federal grants to continue to learn Portuguese and study the region of Latin America. That was the Foreign Language and Area Studies grant. But some of them were also based on my person and a sense of identity or community. And so I was looking in multiple places at the same time based on who I am and what I'm doing. And that was when I stopped thinking only about the university institution as the source of resources. So I could look at the federal government as a source of resources, I can look at my local community in LA and also in Oakland, because that's where I grew up. So those are some of the avenues through which I got funding. With huge grants like the Gates Cambridge Award, that's a very obvious aspect of their recruitment to Cambridge graduate studies, and it's part of your graduate student application, so you see it right there and you fill it out. The ones that are harder to see don't show up when you're going through the motions, so you have to look for them. So those are some of the ways in which I have looked for scholarships for myself.
Got it. Now, I asked for your 3 top tips. If creativity was your first one, what are 2 and 3?
Number 2 is organization. So okay. I think many students discover amazing opportunities 1 week before they're due. And these are huge scholarship applications. Some of them are larger and more time intensive than getting into grad school. So being organized and preemptively sorting out your deadlines and keeping track of them is essential. Yeah. The other reason to do that is a lot of students will start their research and then see that a deadline passed. And they usually think, okay, I'm not going to consider that one. And I'm always saying, no, put it on your calendar for next year. If it's related to you and it's relevant, get it on your calendar. So a lot of my counseling with scholarships does end up, being around a calendar and a spreadsheet. So I'd say organization is tip number 2. And number 3 is, I would say, really building a supportive community for yourself. So identifying mentors and allies, people who will write letters of recommendation for you, and establishing those relationships before you are sitting there trying to get to meet your deadlines. Okay.
Now let's talk about, so it's creativity, organization, and support network, right?
Support network.
Tips. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk about a few of the specific scholarships and what you have found to be key to getting those grants, or even to getting serious consideration for those grants.
Okay.
Let's start. Should we start with the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship? I think you've had some success with that one, right?
Yes. So I started working on the National Science Foundation grants a couple years ago because a couple of students at UCLA came to my office and asked me if I would work with them on it. And at first I was hesitant because I'm not a scientist. So as a grant writer, I thought, there's going to be some science I don't understand. But that actually made me a really good mentor, because as people get more narrow in their scientific fields, whether it's engineering or chemistry, they start to speak in their own language. Sure. And they might assume, so a lot of, if an engineer is applying to the NSF grant, they kind of assume an engineer is going to be on the committee who can translate what they're talking about. But they're already going to a narrow enough direction that if they don't have an engineer of their exact expertise on the committee, their entire committee might not understand what their science is doing. So a lot of the work that I do with students in the sciences is to find a way to articulate the value of their research in broader terms that are more specific than I'm going to help the world, or this is going to save lives.
Right. So, yeah.
So articulating science for someone who's not an expert in your field, or making the leap from I'm doing research about a very large mirror to this mirror will eventually be used to accomplish something very important. That's a lot of the work I end up doing for the research statements on the National Science Foundation. For the personal statements, it's so funny to me what students forget about themselves that's interesting to write about.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, as some more science-oriented students will completely forget to share their personal lives, their personalities, their hobbies, and some of the accomplishments that they've made as people that aren't related to their studies.
Yes, definitely. I've seen that. I can remember talking to a client years ago, a really lovely applicant, and she was doing a great job. And one day she came in and she started telling me that she'd been on a master's swim team, I think throughout college. And we'd
Hmm.
been working together at that point for weeks. And I remember I looked at her and said, "Are you planning to keep this a secret?" I mean, the discipline it showed, the time commitment, and it was like, well, I didn't think it was relevant.
Yep. One of my students who was successful with the NSF,
Yeah.
about halfway through working with her, so it's maybe 3 or 4 sessions in, she said we're working on the personal statement, and I'm asking her sort of, okay, you haven't really talked about what it's like to be a woman in STEM. Is there anything specific to your experience that you want to share? She goes,
Hmm.
oh, I've been volunteering at community colleges all over LA teaching women like biology classes. And I
Yeah.
looked at her personal statement and said, oh, okay, that's not in here.
Yeah.
So she ended up including it. But I think students just forget that they get to be people when they're writing these big grants, and those moments are incredibly important for committees who are reading applications.
Those commitments
Hmm.
that people make or achievements, um, are very important. What about the Fulbright? It's probably one of the most biggest ones.
Fulbright. Oh,
Yeah.
so I've written Fulbright applications for myself, and also worked with many students going to many different countries for Fulbright. And I think the scariest part for students is the letters of affiliation that they have to um, acquire as part of the application.
And
So
what are those?
students have to prove that they are in contact with a community organization or a faculty member or a university that will support them while they're abroad.
Mm-hmm.
So Fulbright doesn't want to just send students and plop them in the middle of nowhere with nothing in terms of support. And the process of getting a letter of affiliation is proof to Fulbright that you can build a support network in a new place, that you can identify people who will support you in your project, and you can identify places to build a sense of community through volunteering or teaching. And students can reach out to organizations on their own and build that kind of a network. But sometimes I think they get nervous. They think someone's supposed to give them permission to do that. But the really together applications for Fulbright have very thoughtful letters of affiliation that students have proactively requested from organizations in the host country.
And that obviously demonstrate that they have relationships in the host countries.
And it also demonstrates they have initiative and that
Yes.
they can reach out across, you know, across countries to establish those relationships. And that
Mm-hmm.
just puts a person who's going to live abroad for a year by themselves, that makes them seem capable of doing that for a year without getting lonely or losing their way. So that is an essential part, and often students wait till the last minute to make those relationships. I would do that first, and then I would actually send my proposal to some of those people as I was drafting it and say, "What do you think?" and get feedback. So I was building a project kind of collaboratively with the people who were writing my letters. That, of course, took several months in advance. I was working on that.
Well, that goes back to organization and creativity, and to a certain extent, developing the network too.
Absolutely. Hmm.
So for Fulbright, you really need all three of those elements.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
You
you, I
really
think
need
I think you
time.
just illustrated how they come together, really.
Yes. That I actually wrote the Fulbright 3 times, and the third time I won. So
Whoa.
by by then I really felt like I had been in touch and in contact and had a strong idea of what my project was. I definitely have worked with students who didn't write it 3 times. They wrote it 1 time and got it. But I think that was my training grounds, was doing that over and over again and really learning how to build strong relationships and be organized and just keep going.
What about the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans? I interviewed Dr. Craig Harwood, the director of the Soros Fellowship for New Americans. That was episode 206. It was a great episode, and obviously it would give his perspective on what the Soros Fellowship is looking for. What do you think makes for a successful Soros Fellowship application?
Well, Soros is an amazing opportunity, and it's one of my favorites. I actually show it to a lot of undergrads who've never thought about scholarships before, because it really demonstrates how creative you have to be about thinking about yourself and the community that you belong to, because the Soros Fellowship is for the immigrant community.
And first generation.
So right. that puts students whose parents are immigrants solidly in a community of immigrants, of people who understand the immigrant experience. And that's kind of amazing. It's a very broad way of thinking about communities, and it also recognizes an experience that's so specific to a lot of people in the United States. So I love that one, and I think it's an amazing opportunity. It usually opens doors to how my students think about opportunities for scholarships and the communities that they belong to. But it's also so competitive, which you pointed out in your podcast as well. Yes. So I think the personal essay becomes so important. It's so incredibly important for the Soros Fellowship application. And students really do put a lot of pressure on themselves when it comes to the personal statement, because they're like, what's it supposed to be about? Does it have to be about obstacles overcome or hardship? And if you look at the eligibility requirements for the Soros Fellowship, that's not necessarily what they're asking for.
Right. What are they asking for?
I think they're asking for self-reflection on what it means to be in the United States as someone who has relationships to people who either were new to the U.S. or are not part of the U.S., because if you're an immigrant, you have family members abroad as well. So there's a comparative self-reflection that goes on in the personal statement, and it requires that students share detailed facts about themselves and tell a story at the same time. So it's a very short document that has a lot of things to accomplish. So I find a lot of times I'm sitting with students and I have this great story that has a lot, it's very artistic and creative, but I'm saying, okay, we still don't know where your parents are from. In the essay.
You may not have much insight into how they think. The applicant thinks.
Or I've seen students forget to mention that they're fluent in another language. But that's because they get really wrapped up in the personal story and in relationship to the United States. And there's an element of having to really describe what your new Americanness is in comparison to other candidates who are also new Americans, that requires the students to really sit down and lay it out in some way, so that the committee has the sense of, okay, I mean, it sounds weird to say, but which moment did your family come to the U.S. and where from and why, as opposed to other families who came to the U.S. So it's a tough, I'm not sure I'm making it sound any easier, but it's a very tough document to write.
I don't think you have to make it sound easier, because it is a tough document to write, and it does require self-reflection and thought, and kind of peeling away some layers to write it authentically. I think that's normal. I think that's true. I think you're reflecting reality there.
Mm-hmm. And then the other, they have the optional exhibits. So students are always, there's a moment where your students are trying to figure out how, like, which optional exhibits to put in and whether or not you have to tie everything together. So that because the committee ends up with a personal statement, a research statement, almost up to 5 letters of recommendation, and a series of optional exhibits. So they have this massive amount of information in front of them. And from my point of view, as a grant writer, we're trying to find a way to ensure that they look at all of it. So sometimes I sit and say, is there anywhere in your personal statement where you could point to one of your exhibits, so that you might encourage your reader to see some more of the work you've put into this application? So I would say that's like one of the final moments that we're working on, is saying, okay, this document also has to get your reader to be interested in the other things you've provided.
Right. Yeah, that could be. So a little question, open a question loop there. Right.
Send them on a journey. Like,
yes.
Incentivize them.
Make them curious.
Exactly.
What about the Tang Scholarship? That was one I haven't heard of actually until.
So I found the Tang Scholarship through one of the great things about all my time at UCLA is the number of students that walk into my office who have backgrounds that are very different from my own, and therefore send me on all kinds of journeys on the internet to find scholarship opportunities. And the Tang Scholarship I learned about working with a particular student who was from the Silicon Valley area and up in Northern California. And I found the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which is an organization that gathers a number of philanthropists in the Silicon Valley who have all created scholarships. And the Tang Scholarship is an example of a scholarship that's very specific to the donor. So the Tang Scholarship is for Pacific Islander and Asian Americans who identify as gay and who are interested in continuing their studies. And there's a number of different fields you can be considered for. And I think it's a great example of what happens whenever an organization is established to become a philanthropy organization. You have a number of donors who have funds and want to share those funds, but each of the donors have different requirements for what they're looking for. So when you go to Silicon Valley Community Foundation, you see a really long list of scholarships that are all very different from one another. But what they have in common is their donors come from the Silicon Valley, and that's where some of the wealth comes from, is the success that these people have had in the industry of tech. And then, if you have a diverse community of people who are successful, you're going to have a really diverse set of interests that are driving their desire to donate money. So it was through the Tang Scholarship and working with a student on it that I learned about the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And again, that's a teaching tool. I always pull up something like that and say, look at this list of scholarships. What do they have in common? All they have in common is that all their donors are from Silicon Valley. So you have to read every single one and all the eligibility requirements. And there's some really fantastic opportunities there. They happen to be pretty specific to the greater Bay Area, but many are applicable.
For example, California. Besides Tang?
Let's see. There's the Latino scholarship for students in STEM. That is trying to encourage diverse representation in technology. And there's also some that are extremely specific, like women at San Jose State University.
Got it. That is very specific.
So, yeah, they get very specific probably because the people who created them have something in common with the candidate that they're looking for. Like they might have been a woman who went to San Jose State.
Right. No, got it. Yeah.
But when I think of these, I think that's usually when I'm asking the student, okay, like geographically, how would you think through your resources? And if you're from the Bay Area, can you identify some organizations that might house scholarships that are related to the fact that you're from the Bay Area? So
Okay.
I'm blowing up the map of scholarships out there.
There is, yeah. There's a lot of options. I just pulled up the Find Scholarship page at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and there's all different ways that you can slice and dice it in terms of the level of education you're pursuing, the geographic area that you're from, U.S. citizens, non-U.S. citizen, ethnicity, gender, anyway, again, there's lots of ways you can filter and search there.
Yes, it's really a good site.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, let's say, in connection with the Cambridge Gates scholarship that you didn't get, but came close to getting?
I think that's similar to any scholarship that's created by a large donor or organization. It's very important to understand what the mission of the organization is. So before you write your Gates Cambridge application, you want to go and see what that organization is all about. Why is Gates giving money for students to go to Cambridge?
Yeah.
What are the goals and missions that are behind that decision of the Gates Foundation? And, you don't want to write your statement using all the exact same language and sort of showing, like, overly stating that you've read the website, but you do really want to think about your relationship to those missions and how you can show that your personal life, your experiences, and your goals might match with a mission like that, or might reinterpret a mission in a way that might surprise the committee and be interesting.
And is that pretty much the function of the scholarship essay, to show that shared mission, shared sense of mission?
So. The Gates Cambridge is part of the general graduate school application, so it also is used when you write that essay. It's also used for other scholarship opportunities. So you'll see it'll say, if you want to be considered for scholarship opportunities, including Gates Cambridge, you have to write this essay. Mm-hmm. So it becomes a moment where you have an audience you can't really predict, but you do know that they're not researchers per se, and they want to know what your missions are, why you want to accomplish the goals you want to accomplish. And so it can't be, if you are, let's go back to the scientist, it can't be something that a non-scientist won't understand. It has to be something personal, part of a journey, part of a broader contribution to society that anyone can understand.
Perhaps, if you want to have a story, there has to be some transformation in the story. There has to be some tension, some change, some growth.
Mm-hmm. A moment of inspiration.
Yeah, that's acted upon.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's also part, when you're showing fit with a mission, I think that there has to be that element, that story element to it also, that, story of growth, transformation, whatever it is, as well as fit.
Yes, I agree.
In the essay. But, I mean, you have more experience with scholarship essays than I do, so I probably shouldn't be talking. I should let you do the talking. Is there anything else that you think is really important for those essays?
Oh, I think students get really stressed out by these essays. And I think a part of the stress is coming from, yes, you have to tell a story. And a lot of students haven't spent a lot of time storytelling for their seminars in class.
Right, especially in the sciences.
Yes. And so the best storytelling comes actually a couple drafts in, because sometimes students are so focused on the fact that they have to tell a story that they get swept up in the sort of technique of storytelling. This is why there are moments where I go and I read it and I say, oh, wow, what language do you speak? It's not in here. Because they're telling this grandiose story and they're really getting into, like, playing with language, which is fantastic. I love it. However, once you've done that, you really have to sit down and go, what does the reader learn about me from this story? So I would say really give yourself time with that, and it's okay if storytelling doesn't feel like it comes to you naturally. This is a very specific kind of storytelling that doesn't come naturally to anyone. So, my favorite, like write as much as you can and then redraft, hopefully 3 times at least.
Right. I had this was before I actually started Accepted. I had a client who wanted me to edit his essays. He's an older man, and he'd gone back to college like in his 60s. And I'd look at he liked to write these very florid, fancy sentences. And I would ask him sometimes, "What does this mean?" And I'd read it to him, and he'd say, "I don't know." I'm like, "Well, how am I supposed to know? If you don't know what you wrote, how am I supposed to know?" And then I'd say, "What are you trying to say?" And he'd say, "Well, I'm trying to say, I don't know, 2 + 2 is 4 or whatever. George Washington was the first president of the United States." Something fairly basic and clear. I said, "Well, why don't you write that?" The first thing sounds so good. I remember saying so clearly, it sounds so good, but doesn't mean anything. But it sounds so good.
Yeah, definitely. And then when you're
the point is communicate.
Facts, when you're relaying facts, it doesn't need to be opaque. It needs to be very clear.
Right. And obfuscation isn't very engaging either. I mean, if you're trying to engage your reader and they just end up being confused, the confused mind says no.
I've read some incredibly powerful statements that just start with, when I was 10, this happened. When I was 12, this happened. I mean, they just go through it moment by moment, and then they explain. Then they start telling the story. But sometimes there's this incredibly blunt, direct moment where all the facts come out, and as a reader, you're kind of like, "Whoa, I gotta keep reading." So it's not always a very fancy sentence that tells the best story. Absolutely.
Now, many of the top scholarships also require an interview. Specifically, the Schwarzman Scholars is, I think, a prime example of that. And I interviewed Dr. Rob Garris, who's the director of admissions for Schwarzman, and anybody who wants to listen to that can go to accepted.com/267 or the show notes, and we'll have it there too. And the show notes are accepted.com/286. But what would you say? Do you have any good advice for scholarship interviews? And you can use the Schwarzman Scholars as an example if you want.
Oh, interviews. I would say if you can set up a mock interview with a group of people that you know and are comfortable with, do it. And time it. Make sure it's as short as the one that you are about to go and experience, because some of them are very, very short. They can be 20 minutes or 30 minutes long. And you're going to have so many nerves that are just sitting there. If those will just get in the way of a 30-minute interview. So if you can practice dealing with those nerves and dealing them within a short time span, I think that's essential. We do that a lot at the Scholarship Resource Center. We put together fake committees, and we try to be kind of like as tough as we can in those environments, so that the student gets a sense of themselves in a sort of scary situation or like high pressured situation. So I would say doing mock interviews is a great idea. And then I think being up to date on current events that are like anything that's going on recently that might be a headline. You might get someone who asks you something about current events, and it might throw you. Sometimes they ask questions you're not expecting or not prepared for. So trying to be a little up on the current events and also having a good strategy for moving along to a new question if you get a question that you aren't prepared to answer. Those are some things I'm thinking about.
Okay. And there was one more scholarship that I meant to ask about and just skipped over it in my notes. And so if we could go back for a minute to Stanford Knight Hennessy.
Oh, yes. So the Stanford Knight Hennessy is a relatively new scholarship. I think it started...
Yeah. It's very new.
second cycle that it's going through. And it has a similar sort of mission and setup as the Gates Cambridge Scholarship. So it's set up by the Knight Hennessy folks, and they have a very different, so in this case, Knight Hennessy might have a different mission than Stanford. And so you really need to look at the mission of Knight Hennessy when you're applying through the program. And the other thing that's tough about Knight Hennessy is it speeds up the timeline. So you have to apply for Knight Hennessy pretty early in the fall. And if you want to be considered for it, you have to apply to your graduate program, which is a totally separate application process, much earlier in the season than you would if you were just applying to Stanford. So the timing for Stanford Knight Hennessy is also very important because you basically need your letter writers to be ahead of the curve on the general graduate school application season. As for the personal statement, I really like their prompt. It's sort of a connect the dots prompt. That's what it looks like this year. And if you read it carefully, when they say, please connect the dots for us, they're saying be as clear as possible about how you ended up where you are. Connect yourself together so that we understand you as a whole. And I kind of like that because from a perspective of someone who's always coaching students, sometimes the prompts aren't very clear about that you have to do that.
Right. Well, that
prompt we're always saying.
That prompt is clear. But I also think connect the dots. It's not just, well, first I did this, then I did that, then I did this, then I did that. I think connect the dots would be, why did you make decisions you did?
Exactly. And connecting dots that, might make an interesting shape that's different from other people's connections of their dots.
Right. And perhaps also show how you would contribute to the Stanford community. Whatever area you want to study at Stanford.
And then Knight Hennessy isn't necessarily trying to make a whole bunch of professors.
Right.
But your grads program probably is. So your personal statement and for Knight Hennessy might be a little different than your statement for your grad program. Just have two different audiences.
True. But they still have to complement each other.
Of course.
If one reads the other's essay and it has a completely different goal in mind, it could be a problem.
Well, the way it works with Knight Hennessy is that if you're accepted to the program, the graduate program, then so the programs have to make decisions early with those applications, and then Knight Hennessy reads your Knight Hennessy essay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So they don't necessarily, they do have to complement each other, but the faculty may not read your Knight Hennessy essay.
Knight Hennessy might read your.
Yes.
Knight Hennessy might read. Yeah. And then last question is, what do you wish I would have asked you?
Oh, I like this question. I'm just going to indulge in some self-loathing through it. I think.
Go for it.
No one at a interview, like a high pressured interview, has ever really asked me about writing, about how I write.
Okay.
And so much of this work, so much of what you and I are talking about, so much of what Accepted helps clients do is work through the writing process. And it's hard for everyone. So sometimes, very rarely, students ask me if writing is hard for me too. And then I'm like, yes, it's very hard.
Hard work. It's hard work.
It's a lot of work. And it's never something anyone asks you about, and it's something I ask people about because one of the big questions I have for my students is, how do you write? What's your favorite part of the writing process? Do you see it as a process?
What do you do if they say nothing?
Well, then I sit down and, then I start breaking it up and say, well, maybe you don't realize it's a process, but there's a part where you're brainstorming. There's a part where you're just generating content, which I think is the most important part, but actually happens to be the hardest part for me. I love editing because the raw material's already been created.
Right.
But sitting down and just getting content onto the page that doesn't exist before, that's my personal torture. And everyone has different parts of the process that they're scared of. And that's what collaboration sort of brings out your strengths, because one person's going to be good in one area of the writing, another person might have strength at a different part of the process. So I'm battling, but the main question that I wanted you to ask me was like, is writing hard for you too? And the answer is yes.
Okay. So nobody has to be ashamed. I mean, Rebecca, again, is going for her PhD in Comparative Lit. She writes all kinds of things. She advises people on writing. I think you've also taught writing. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's okay to find writing difficult, is I think the takeaway from this part of the podcast. And I will admit, I do a lot of writing, and what is my hardest part? It probably is just getting started, organizing my thoughts into something coherent. Then I can usually write. I either just do an outline, or I sometimes use MindMaster, and I use a mind map if it's a more complex document.
Great.
But just kind of getting my thoughts organized. I rarely, if ever, I mean, if I'm writing a letter or an email, I'll do it. But if it's anything more important than that, I don't just sit down and write. I'll take a minute to compose my thoughts, the structure of what I want to say, and the main point I want to get across. Mm-hmm. And I think that in writing, having a main point that you want to get across is really, really, really important.
Yeah. Yes. I think sometimes it's hard. Sometimes when you're just getting started, you don't know what your main point is supposed to be. So yes. Some people freeze. They're waiting for the right main point. And that happens to me. I might have some vague sense of direction. And so then I just let myself explore. I'm like, okay, I just need to write through what I think I might want to write about. And for me, that's just sometimes a longer process. And once you discover the main point, yes, you can move forwards and keep going. There's so many moments where you might have doubt about what that main point is or whether it's the best one. So you have to ignore all of those moments.
Yeah, just keep plugging away.
Yeah.
Because that moment will come. Mm-hmm. Rebecca, I think we're running out of time. I want to thank you so very much for joining me for this Admission Straight Talks 286th episode. And I want to thank you again for sharing your personal and professional experience and perspective.
Thanks so much for letting me share. It's been fun.
It's been fun. Listener, if you'd like to work with Rebecca on your grad school or scholarship applications, I'll link from the show notes at accepted.com/286 to both Rebecca's Contact Me page and our grad school services, as well as to other related resources and previous podcast episodes. I want to thank you too, listener, for tuning into this, our 286th episode. If you found this show worthwhile, please make sure you don't miss any others. Subscribe through your favorite podcatcher. We have subscribe links in the show notes at accepted.com/286. This is Admission Straight Talk, produced by Accepted, and I'm your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.
Our theme music is provided by podcastthemes.com. 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 Podcastthemes.com.